Boa noite, pessoal. Dando continuidade aqui às nossas atividades do segundo dia do FINPE. Teremos agora a nossa conferência sobre o desenvolvimento de treinadores esportivos com a professora doutora Diane Culver. A professora doutora Diane Culver é a professora associada da Escola de Desenvolvimento Humano da Universidade de Ottawa, no Canadá. É membro do Comitê de Pesquisa e consultora da Associação Canadense de Treinadores desde o ano de 2007. Enquanto treinadora, foi treinadora da seleção canadense de esqui alpino e também da equipe olímpica da Nova Zelândia, e ela é uma das principais referências na área de formação de treinadores, aprendizagem social, programas de desenvolvimento de treinadoras e de treinadores no esporte adaptado. So, welcome, Professor Diane. It's a big pleasure to have you here again to share this conference with you. I will be mediating your conference. So again, it's a pleasure to have you in Brazil. And again, it's a pleasure personally for me to have you here sharing your wisdom and all your knowledge in coaching development. Thank you so much.
Obrigada, Michelle. Boa noite, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I really value my work with my Brazilian colleagues, so it's a pleasure to present tonight some of my pathway that you'll see through my research and work with coach development.
Thank you so much. Pessoal, a gente vai fazer agora a apresentação da fala da Diane com as legendas em português, e ao final a gente volta aqui para a tela ao vivo para os questionamentos e perguntas. Então, espero que aproveitem e vão colocando as dúvidas no chat, por favor, que depois a gente vai fazer a tradução para que ela responda. Muito obrigado.
Boa noite. Seja bem-vindo. Estou muito honorado por estar aqui. And I wish to thank very much the organizers of this conference for inviting me and putting together such a great conference. I will start sharing my screen now to begin my presentation, which is called Social Learning Theory, a Place in Coach Development. As far as the outline for tonight, I will start with a little about my own pathway before going into learning more generally, as well as coach development, talking about contexts and situations and other important words and other concepts and models that have shaped my thinking about coach development over the past 25 years. After this, I will move on to the evolution of social learning theory, its concepts, some myths, and how it has been used in coach development research. And finally, we will have time for some questions. So Peter Jarvis wrote extensively about lifelong learning. For Jarvis, biography is the sum of all of our previous experiences. So my pathway, at least the one that led me here today in terms of being able to provide this presentation, began as an athlete. I was an alpine skier, competing at the world level before retiring quite young and moving into coaching, where after only one season, I was asked to be an assistant coach with the national ski team. Obviously, this was a dream. I was super excited by the prospect of learning from the coaches around me in that context. But ultimately, I was frustrated by the lack of sharing and collective reflection, and even in some case by the lack of knowledge demonstrated. This prompted me to step back and involve myself in other contexts where I felt I might better learn about skiing and teaching skiing and coaching. For example, I worked in a top ski school and took all my instructor levels, eventually becoming a trainer of ski instructors of the highest level, as well as representing Canada at an event called Interski, which is a quadrennial gathering of national ski schools where teams demonstrate their country's skiing technique through synchronized demonstrations. Like if you can see those small skiers in the picture at the bottom left of that series of pictures on the left of your screen. I returned after this, after about 5 years, to many more years of coaching at the national and international level. Finally, I decided to return to university and study sport pedagogy and psychology, where I discovered Wenger's work and the concept of communities of practice. In his work and in this concept, I found a way to articulate my experience and beliefs about learning. While I still coach my sport on weekends in the winter, my full-time work now is researching and consulting about coach development and sport leadership. Thus, for the last 20 years plus, I have used social learning theory in my research and practice. Now I just want to talk more generally about two views of learning: acquisition, which could be represented by the lecture hall you see on the top right of your picture, and participation, represented in this image of a coach in Haiti on a coach development course that we delivered, learning about strength training. The first of these views is the acquisition view. This is the dominant view or traditional view. It is traditional as it relates to the education systems of modern society. Not historical, not traditional as in historical, because historically, the whole concept of education only goes back about 4,000 years to China. For European countries and societies, the appearance of schools and formal education began as late as the 16th century and even in some cases, the 19th century. For hundreds of thousands of years before the agricultural revolution, children learned through free play, observation, exploration, and cooperation, and indeed, so did adults. In this acquisition view, learners are expected to accumulate knowledge through a process of transmission. So here we think of the concept of learners as empty vessels. Experts decide what is to be learned and when, in what order, and then the learner takes these bricks of knowledge, as Jennifer Moon calls them, and builds their wall of knowledge. From there, it is largely left to the learner to figure out how to apply this knowledge in the practice context. A second view of learning is the participation view. This view is more aligned with historical ways of learning mentioned above, and this view has made a comeback in recent decades. It has the learner constructing or co-constructing knowledge based on their participation in learning activities and practices. Like Jarvis's theory of lifelong learning, here the previous experiences of the learner and their current orientation and motivation toward learning will direct what they pay attention to and what they learn. With that, it is very unlikely that any two of you here this evening will leave having constructed the same knowledge. Here are some important words that we use in coach development. We will see them again over the next few slides. As indicated by the title of the slide, words are important. Here we see formal, non-formal, and informal as places of learning, mediated, unmediated, and internal as learning situations. And at the bottom, we see learning context and learning situation. Moon suggests a distinction between learning context and learning situation. The learning context is the setting in which learning occurs, the course, the instructor, the organization, and so on. And the learning situation is the learner's perception of the context, and it is unique to each learner. And that is from Moon. The distinction between learning context and learning situation is important because, as Trudell, Culver, and Gilbert stated in their 2013 chapter, it allows us to discuss learning from both the coach learner's perspective, that is the learning situation, and from the coach developer's perspective, the individuals in charge of providing adequate learning contexts to coaches. This evening, the conference organizers, and in this presentation myself, are creating a learning context. And what you leave with is a reflection of your personal learning situation. This slide is about how coaches learn. That is the various contexts through which they learn. We see again the two views of learning just discussed, acquisition and participation, but a little more about that now. Largely taken from Trudell and Gilbert's 2006 chapter on coach learning, this figure looks at formal, non-formal, and informal learning contexts. On the left, the blue bubble, formal, falls into the acquisition view, and it usually refers to large-scale programs delivered by institutions, where often certification is the goal. Such programs are usually delivered along a novice to expert continuum, such as levels 1 through 5. About 20 years ago, some institutions, such as the Coaching Association of Canada, shifted from a focus on what coaches should know to what coaches should do. That is, their competencies. So this was a competency-based approach, which is still in use today with the Coaching Association of Canada. What a coach needs to know is driven by who they are coaching. Therefore, modules are often context-based. For example, for coaches working with children being initiated to a sport or working with high-performance athletes. Non-formal clinics are held by sport organizations, usually around specific techniques or topics. On the right, in the participation view, we have informal learning or learning from and through experience. Here is where lifelong learning, reflection, and becoming are important. We see in the big blue arrow at the bottom right, a very typical pathway to coaching, whereby an athlete starts becoming a coach, even still while they are an athlete, moving to eventually, if they so choose, an assistant coach, and finally to a head coach. This slide portrays from Moon and the work that Werthner and Trudell, Culver, and Werthner have done, exploring how coaches learn. On the top left, you will see mediated. That is mediated by another person. The focus here is on the material of teaching, and it is driven by another. On the top right, you see unmediated, where the focus is the material of learning, driven by the learner. Here, the learner seeks knowledge from outside of themselves, books, videos, others. At the bottom, you'll see internal. The internal experience is, quote, the experience that the learner brings to the learning situation from her current cognitive structure. And that's a quote of Moon. The cognitive structure is akin to Jarvis's concept of biography. Once again, the sum of our previous experiences, culminating at any given moment in our approach to learning, emotional state, and current knowledge structures and schemas. Another important concept to consider here is the stages of learning. So you see the blue boxes. At the top level, both left and right, we see stages 1, 2, 3. Stages 1 and 2, noticing, where ideas are memorized, and making sense, where ideas are reproduced but not well linked, are forms of surface learning. At stage 3, making meaning, in which learning is meaningful with ideas beginning to be linked and well integrated into our cognitive structure, we now start to engage in deeper learning. At the bottom blue box, you see stages 4 and 5. working with meaning, which is meaningful and reflective, and transformative, which is meaningful, reflective, and has the learner restructuring ideas and concepts in a creative way. Levels 4 and 5, stages 4 and 5, are deep learning. Pulling together some of the words we have just seen, we can see through any of formal, non-formal, or informal learning contexts. We can go away and engage in internal learning, reflective -- cognitive housekeeping. And to enrich this process, we may seek advice or help from others, either through mediated or unmediated learning situations. This slide touches in a detailed way about reflection and learning through experience. Schoen, 1983 and 1987, wrote about reflection in action and learning through, that is, learning through experience, and reflection on action, learning from experience. Reflection can be individual or collective. For individual reflection, in relation to coach development and the works that have influenced our studies, we see Kolb, Mesereau, particularly about adult learning, Schoen, Gilbert and Trudel, and Moon. Gilbert and Trudel also referred to a type of collective learning, which we will see below. For collective reflection. For collective reflection, other examples that we see are action learning and action science, more commonly seen in domains outside of sport, and communities of practice and appreciative inquiry, which are widely used across many domains such as business, medicine, education, and sport. An example of research regarding social learning theory and appreciative inquiry is Bertram, Culver, and Gilbert in the May 2016 issue of Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner. Here, based on several decades of using social learning theory in coaching research, we explored, quote, how social learning theory can be used to enhance sport coaching practice, framed within the 4-step appreciative inquiry model, the 4D model: discover, dream, design, and destiny. Here in this slide, many of you will recognize Gilbert and Trudel's 2001 model of the reflective conversation for model youth sport coaches. This is about learning through experience. The role frame, like a picture frame, acts as a filter through which all potential issues are screened. This frame is composed of fixed or boundary concepts, that is, givens, such as those related to the context. For instance, your athlete's age, gender, competition level, etc. And a second type of component of the role frame are personal elements related to a coach's philosophy. For example, how important it is to them that their team wins, or should they have fun, or should they have fun and try and win as well? Discipline and the development of life skills are all examples of internal components of a role frame. There are 4 steps in the conversation represented by the 4 ovals in the figure. Issue setting, starting at the top, deciding what the issue is. Strategy generation for addressing the issue. Experimentation, which moves from planning to action. And evaluation. For each of these steps, the coach can either use their personal resources, here represented in the bottom half of the ovals, or resort to help from outside themselves, represented here in the top half of the ovals. For example, for strategy generation, the big oval in the middle. On the top half, we have advice seeking, joint construction, and reflective transformation, wherein a strategy modeled from observing another coach is transformed to fit the coach's role frame. So we can see above, I talked about Gilbert and Trudel having aspects of both individual and collective reflection. And we can clearly see here that joint construction would be an example of collective reflection. In this slide, we see again the model of reflective conversation with the addition of 2 yellow boxes. Added here are important conditions that influence the likelihood and nature of the reflective conversation. Importantly, for where we are going next, that is social learning theory, is a coach's access to peers. Without peers, many of the options in the upper halves of the ovals are not possible. For example, joint construction. The other conditions are the coach's stage of learning. If coaches engage in more surface learning, they will be less reflective, as we saw in slide 10. Also, issue characteristics are important. For example, in case of imminent danger, when immediate action is required, which likely is prescribed and potentially even has a protocol as to how a coach should act, this is not the time to start a reflective conversation. Finally, the environment is a factor. In highly hierarchical, structured environments, such as the military, reflection is often not highly encouraged, at least not at the lower levels of the hierarchy. So, just summing up, we've looked at individual and collective reflection, and we're going to move on to social learning, in which both those types of reflection are intertwined with action. The basic assumptions of social learning theory are that 1, humans are fundamentally social beings. Learning is at the core of our existence. Otherwise, we would not have survived as a species. And finally, that as we learn, we become, hence we develop our identity as long as we are learning. We are always becoming. So those assumptions underlie all aspects of social learning theory. The next, we're going to talk about the evolution of the theory and concepts related, which are social learning spaces, situated learning, communities of practice, value creation framework, and landscapes of practice. The term social learning spaces is a more recent addition to the theory that is a much more pervasive concept, which crosses over the other concepts that you see. First, I will quickly review the other concepts and provide some examples of research for each phase. Situated learning is learning that is not separated from the activity in which it is used. Okay, so the example of the participation of the coach in Haiti, learning about strength, how to coach strength training by actually doing it in the coaching clinic that we were giving there. So this is based on, it's what Wenger, a trainer, refers to as phase 1 of the theory. It is based on the work that he did with Jean Lave about apprentices and apprenticeship. By the way, both Lave and Wenger are anthropologists originally. An example of this type of situated learning in sport is a paper by Richard Light called Situated Learning in an Australian Surf Club, published in Sport Education and Society. From the abstract, I read that the paper is about how membership in the surf club and participation in its practices over time provides the participants with access to resources for understanding and cultural knowledge through growing involvement in the practice. In so doing, It suggests that there is a need to view physical learning as a complex process that is inseparable from social and cultural webs of experience. Next, we talk about communities of practice, and starting with what is not a community of practice. Being social creatures, we like to get together and talk, like portrayed in the left-hand cartoon box there. Coaches are certainly no exception. However, just getting together and getting tips, tools, friendship, and network does not make a community of practice. Likewise, a team, task force, or project team is not necessarily a community of practice. Other myths relating to communities of practice are that communities can be established overnight and that they are an easy solution to everything. This is not true. Maintaining and sustaining a productive community of practice can take quite a bit of effort and planning. Partial myths are such as that communities of practice require a master practitioner as a leader. In fact, oftentimes leaders are not master practitioners. They are either practitioners on a level with many others, but somebody who has the ability to be a social learning leader, has knowledge about how to keep the learning agenda being driven by the participants of members of the community of practice. Another partial myth is that communities of practice often become echo chambers. So by that, I mean, when you call your name out in a cave, you hear the echo of yourself calling it out. So in that way, they're reproducing existing practices. And we'll look at that a little more closely in the next slide. So in this slide, we're going to move on to what is a community of practice. But as you will learn, there are two versions of community of practice. One, portrayed here, is a phase one community of practice. In this sense, like in an apprenticeship, there is a strict regime of competence. There is longevity in that this competence and this practice has been developed over time, and it takes time to become a competent member of that community. There is a shared practice, and identity is constructed based on the regime of competence. So an apprentice knows that they are not a fully competent member of that community of practice. They are a new member who is learning. The problem with this phase one type of community of practice, which has often been critiqued, is that there is a danger of ossification. So what is ossification? It means the structure becomes hard, like a bone. It no longer moves to creating new knowledge. So therefore, we have this concept of reproduction versus creation of knowledge. Some sport contexts, such as traditional karate, where leadership is very hierarchical, are not conducive to a coach community of practice. The sensei is all-powerful. Therefore, there is no possibility for coaches co-creating knowledge, as this would be challenging the status quo. This is the type of community described just now. And you can see also Levenwenger in 1991, where apprentices participate in the community as they gradually learn to become competent in a trade in which competence is usually proscribed by a master or set of masters. In this type of community, knowledge can become ossified. It is therefore not a myth that certain types of communities of practice can result in the reproduction of existing practices. They are a history of social learning over time, without going beyond these in the creation of new knowledge. Also a community of practice, but of the phase two variety, is a social learning space, a community of practice that's a social learning space. It is generative and pushes the knowledge of participants beyond their existing knowledge. So there is a shared desire to make a difference, although that difference is definitely drives the learning, but there's also a feeling of not knowing where we're going to go, not knowing what we don't know yet, but being excited about going there. Identity is constructed based on that caring to make a difference. And participants are working at the edge of their own learning. In this slide, you see a cartoon which describes the cycles of individual and collective reflection intertwined with action that characterizes a phase 2 community of practice. This cartoon portrays what happens in a community of practice of this type. So on the top left, we see we do stuff together because we want to make a difference. And I love being with others who recognize the difference I want to make. And also appreciate my uncertainty, appreciate that I'm trying to muddle through. I get ideas, tips, tools, friendships, and a network, and I take these back to my practice and put them to use. I pay attention to what's happening when I put them in use. What's the effect of these new ideas in my practice? And I take this back to others who want to make a difference. Thus, we see that the cycles of action and reflection continue, and we see the integration of collective and individual reflection. We can therefore see that a community of practice is indeed a community of inquiry, a type of action research, a form of learning and changing practice. The next concept we want to look at is the value creation framework, portrayed here on the left. It is important to note, and I quote here from Wenger Trainer et al. 2019, that value here refers to importance, worth, or usefulness rather than moral standards, even if the two are related. So we see immediate value in black, the first black oblong, and that is about what the experience is like. And then paired with it is potential, what comes out of that experience. Moving across to the right, we have applied value. What are you learning in applying it? And realized value, what difference does it make? The other four value cycles, enabling, strategic, orienting, and transformative, are also very important. And you can see the questions related to them here. They can affect those within the social learning space, both directly and indirectly. The two Duarte et al. 2021 papers shown on the right here are both open access and provide excellent examples of using the value creation framework. First, for framing, that is planning, designing in an itinerant fashion, what you're doing in your social learning space, as well as assessing in the bottom paper. From Culver and Duarte 2021, a CERC blog, which you see here, they were referenced to, you'll now see a deck of value creation reflective cards. The idea behind these cards, and I'm quoting from the blog, is for social learning leaders to keep them easily accessible and check them regularly to help reflect on the state of your social learning space. For example, you may have a clear idea of your aspirations, the change you would like to see. Here you would start with realized value card. From there, working with your social learning space, you would explore what must be put in place to achieve that realized value. So you might then consider what potential and immediate value need to be created, and whether there are strategic and enabling values that should be considered. Likewise, you may have an example of realized value from another context that you decide to present to your social learning space, at which point it may become potential value in your social learning space. The act of using the value cards to reflect on social learning spaces is not a one-off activity. It should be conducted throughout your project. In this way, assessing value and framing activities are intertwining processes. Yeah, another important, relatively new concept is that of the landscapes of practice, which is a series of communities of practice, networks, and other social learning spaces that make up the whole body of knowledge of a profession. So if we think of coaching, even in a club, a large club, all the knowledge related to coaching across those different groups in that club would not be contained likely in one community of practice. Rather, there would probably be a number of different communities of practice, the networks between them, and the whole together would create a landscape of practice. Research related to landscapes of practice are two examples here. One, Vinson et al., 2020. And this one from the abstract says that it examined the usefulness of utilizing the landscape of practice framework to better understand social learning, specifically focusing on boundary interactions experienced by 14 international coaches from 11 sports. This investigation found strong support for the usefulness of the LOP framework, that is landscape framework. Furthermore, knowledgeability and boundary interactions were insightful concepts to better understand how coaches learned through interactions within and beyond the program. For example, cross-sport interactions enabled some coaches to learn more effectively because they felt less encumbered by peers' judgments when compared to other environments. The bottom paper that you see by Culver et al. Is a best practice paper describing a Canadian intervention to address the lack of women in sport coaching and leadership roles. While the number of female athletes has increased over the last decades, the opposite is true of female head coaches, and this both nationally and internationally. The issues influencing this trend are mostly institutional and societal. The Alberta Women in Sport Leadership Impact Program takes a community/landscape of practice approach to increase gender equity and leadership diversity in Alberta sport organizations. The initiative not only included a multi-level approach to involve key players and organizations from across the sport system, but the program used a landscape approach. The Alberta Women in Sport Leadership Initiative truly spanned all levels of the Canadian sport landscape. It was funded by a department of the federal government and led by an employee of a national non-government organization, the Coaching Association of Canada, who partnered with a provincial multi-service sport organization, that is the Alberta Sport Connection, 6 mentors, and 12 provincial sport/multi-service sport organizations. The sport leaders from these 12 organizations each implemented and evaluated a program aimed at greater equity and leadership development. As researchers, we were able to generate data across all levels, from national to international participants in the community of practice and the landscape, even some of the participants in the sport leaders programs. Therefore, touching on the landscape of practice. The articles of this project recount the experiences of several key stakeholders in the sport, including coach developers, directors, professors, head coaches, assistant coaches, athletes, and more. Finally, we come back to the term social learning spaces. In 2009, Wenger defined these as, quote, places of genuine encounters among learners where they can engage their experience of practice. Since that time, the definition has become more refined, along with the relationship between communities of practice and social learning spaces. From the CERC blog paper by Culver and Duarte, 2021, I read, social learning spaces are mechanisms for learning and change that enable participants to create knowledge and formulate new ways of doing the things they care about. This doing is our practice and can refer to anything from coaching a specific group of athletes to developing sport leaders to promoting social justice in their organization. Social learning spaces are not defined by physical area, but by the social relationships of the participants, along with a mutual understanding that they can learn together. 3 important characteristics of social learning spaces, which make them different than participation in other places of interaction, are that participants care to make a difference about something, engage uncertainty, and pay attention to data. So a little more about those 3 things. But first, much of this that I am saying in our learning that we're exploring in our research is based on the 2020 book by the Wenger trainers called Learning to Make a Difference. This title of this book, Learning to Make a Difference, has a double meaning. It can mean learning in order to make a difference, and also learning how to make a difference. And the authors intentionally made it that way. So for the 3 important characteristics of participating in a social learning space, caring to make a difference, that is, having a passion to learn and affect change, is necessary, but not sufficient to make a social learning space. What makes a social learning space distinct from other groups where people gather around a passion, for instance, a reading group, is that the other participants appreciate and indeed welcome the uncertainty resulting from, quote, the tension between caring to make a difference and having a clear path to get there, end of quote. Wenger trainer, 2020. Participants are also committed to working together to muddle through key issues while paying attention to the effects of any changes made to practice. Obrigada. I hope you leave with some thoughts about how you can make a difference for sport and excitement to engage in uncertainty. I'm open to questions now, and should you not get an answer to your question this evening, please do not hesitate to email me at my email, which is posted above.
Thank you, Diane, again for one more bright presentation and very reflective. We all the time are thinking about this theory and how you are operating our system. Thank you so much. Obrigado, Diane. Essa apresentação foi incrível. Acho que mais uma vez ela coloca a gente para pensar e refletir sobre a teoria social e quanto ela é próxima das nossas ações na prática, e entendendo um pouco sobre a própria teoria, a gente também consegue melhorar nossas próprias ações. Pessoal, por favor, se tiverem perguntas, vão colocando no chat. O pessoal aqui da organização está nos ajudando com a tradução, e de antemão já quero agradecer ao grupo responsável pela tradução, Elcio, Paula, que fizeram aí essa tradução hoje. A gente até atrasou um pouquinho para deixar na linha para todos vocês. Espero que vocês possam ter conseguido acompanhar pela densidade mesmo da própria teoria, então fica muito mais fácil tendo elas em português. Pessoal, eu vou endereçar aqui algumas perguntas, por favor, coloquem no chat. A primeira delas é da professora Michele Viviane Carbinato, perguntando sobre a possibilidade de pesquisar, como é possível pesquisar sobre comunidade de prática, se no início é até difícil da gente entender quando ela começa e o que é uma comunidade de prática. So, Diane, if you can address Michelle's question, it's a good one to start?
Well, it's interesting because when we look at the research that has been done with this theory and coach development, at the beginning, we mostly, not entirely, but we mostly looked at organic communities of practice. So this is the kind of community you're talking about. Do you want to translate as I go?
Sim. Yes. No início das pesquisas em comunidade de prática, então, antes de pesquisar a organização, era muito importante, eles buscavam identificar comunidades orgânicas de prática, que são as comunidades que ela deu um exemplo. Can you explain what is organic concept?
Yes, organic is what we're calling what Michelle's talking about. It's like a community of practice that didn't develop as a result of an intervention.
Ok, então o que ela responde é que a comunidade de prática orgânica é aquela que já é estabelecida sem qualquer intervenção de um formador ou de alguém que esteja intencionalmente buscando criá-las. Então o exemplo que ela deu inicialmente das artes marciais é uma comunidade de prática orgânica.
At least an intervention from outside. Like it could be an intervention from an internal leader, maybe a head coach or a technical director.
Ou que poderia ser intencionalmente, mas de alguém de dentro da própria comunidade tentando buscar organizar esse grupo como um meio de aprender conjuntamente.
So, if you're trying to research such a community of practice, like Michelle said, you're unlikely to be there at the beginning of it. So you're probably going to be looking at the beginning part retrospectively, which is what we did in the beginning. In fact, what Wenger, trainer, really did in his 1998 book with the insurance claims workers.
Então, e nesse início, eles buscavam entender qual era o funcionamento das comunidades. Então, a Diane tem, um dos primeiros artigos que ela fez foi buscar entender como se organizava a comunidade que já era estabelecida, essas comunidades orgânicas, que foi um grupo de beisebol. E um dos primeiros livros do Wenger, da comunidade de prática, eles mostram diferentes grupos de diferentes áreas também, explicando como eles se organizavam, de que maneira era operada essas comunidades.
So, like I referred to in the presentation, learning through participation is ancient way of learning. It's really the original way that we learned, right? When it was studied, like when Wenger and Lev and Wenger started studying it, it was really an attempt to document an ancient way of learning that still exists in some situations, right?
Então, ela comenta que a aprendizagem em grupos é uma das aprendizagens mais antigas do mundo. A gente entende pela lógica medieval, uma lógica artesanal de aprendizagem, e isso é estabelecido em muitos grupos. Então, essa foi uma das primeiras preocupações em entender as comunidades de prática, de como o processo de aprendizagem acontecia nesses grupos que já eram estabelecidos.
So, I mean, if we think about children in school, like Wenger said, instead of teaching children how to be scientists in school, we're teaching them all these concepts about science totally removed from the actual practice, right? So their hope was to influence the education system in some way as well. And from there, for continuing education for adults.
Então, o propósito deles estudarem as comunidades de prática, ela traz um exemplo de como a gente tem descontextualizado a prática e fragmentado nos programas de formação. Então, ela dá o exemplo de se a gente quer ensinar crianças a serem cientistas, a gente leva elas às escolas, às universidades e ensina sobre ciência, mas não como ser cientista, que é o processo intrínseco relacionado à prática e à experiência. Então, o propósito dessa teoria é buscar também ajudar a educação a conseguir melhorar processos estruturados para que a experiência seja interligada junto nas formações de adultos ou mesmo de crianças e adolescentes.
I can answer some of the other questions that I can see that Paula's put in here. So the one about, can teachers and coaches transform themselves for a better person? Or no, that one, yes, they can.
I can bring the second one that Heitor sent me.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
I was saying in Portuguese before, como a evolução da teoria de aprendizagem social tem sido integrada no seu grupo de pesquisas e nos seus esforços. Rapidamente, sinteticamente, quais são as principais evidências dessas pesquisas para a área de formação de treinadores? So, can you read the Heitor question, Diane?
Yep, no problem. Thanks, Heitor. I hope you're well. So, actually doing a review right now of the articles published around using the theory in coach development. What we see is many articles that really, explore the concept of community of practice, but are not going a lot deeper than that into the newer parts of the theory. I don't know if you want to translate that part.
Eles têm feito algumas revisões de literatura sobre os estudos que utilizaram as comunidades de prática, e o que eles entendem e conseguiram compreender é que muitos estudos têm trazido conceitos sobre a comunidade de prática, mas os conceitos iniciais ainda da teoria, e não os conceitos mais novos e a evolução de que tem se tratado, que ela apresentou hoje para nós.
So, in terms of our research group, we did start with the community of practice of coaches and trying to develop, their knowledge, develop those coaches. And we've moved from there into using the value creation framework. So those papers that you'll see in the presentation, for not just assessing. First, we just used it to assess, but now we're using it to plan, design, and frame the learning activities as we go through working with the social learning space.
Então, com a publicação do framework de avaliação de valor, que foi publicado em 2014 inicialmente, o grupo da Diane tem trabalhado não apenas na avaliação da aprendizagem em comunidades de prática, mas, sobretudo, no planejamento, na gestão, no desenho de comunidades e, sim, nos produtos dessas aprendizagens também dentro dessas comunidades que foram delineadas, e foi um dos exemplos que ela trouxe e apresentou na fala dela.
And even some of our research that wasn't even using social learning theory, but was looking at how, for instance, in Canada, the coach developers that work for the Coaching Association of Canada, how they deliver their courses and how they try and do what they're supposed to do. We saw that you can't just change the whole system by focusing on the coach developers, even though they're the ones that contact the coaches, but if they are working within a system. So you need to take a multi-level approach. And this is also where we've gone with the landscape approach, trying to look at the different levels of the system to really bring about change and to support coaches and coach developers to be able to better develop coaches.
E uma das evidências muito interessantes que eles tiveram trabalhando com os formadores de treinadores no Canadá, pela perspectiva das comunidades de prática, que eles entenderam que não adiantava apenas lidar ou trabalhar com os formadores, gerando comunidades, eles precisavam também entender uma ideia de sistema todo integrado que faz parte da formação de treinadores. Então, a evolução da teoria das comunidades para o landscape de prática, que é a paisagem de prática, ajuda eles também a interpretarem e terem uma leitura maior dessa paisagem e de quais agentes e comunidades eles também têm que trabalhar. E aí envolve diretores, patrocinadores, gestores e não apenas os formadores. Então, por isso que a evolução da teoria também dá condições de ampliar o olhar sobre o sistema esportivo criado.
So there's two things that I would like to say which answer in part some of the questions here. One is that the theory and even the theorists, Wenger trainers, say, the theory is one that blends very easily with other theories. You can call plug and play. So for example, if we're talking about levels of the system, in the Alberta Women in Sport Leadership Project, we use Bronfenbrenner's model, which had previously been used by Nicole Laffoy about how to get more women coaches, right? So that, and we also used action research blended with communities of practice social learning theory.
Então, o que a Diane explica, e até trazendo resposta para algumas das perguntas colocadas, é que utilizar teorias sociais de aprendizagem também é a chance de fazer combinações de teorias para entender fenômenos mais complexos. Então, ela deu exemplo de utilizar as teorias do Wenger com outras teorias falando de níveis de desenvolvimento estruturais, ou utilizar a pesquisação com outra forma de trabalho e teoria também. Então, utilizar a teoria social de aprendizagem é fazer como se fosse um quebra-cabeças que você responde por partes, enxerga um fenômeno e consegue fazer ligações em outros aspectos e também com outras teorias.
Okay, and the other question is about how do you start a community of practice for graduate students? So, yeah, you can say what I'm going to say.
Yeah, sorry. Como a gente pode estimular os estudantes a desenvolverem comunidades de prática?
So I'm really going to answer this. It doesn't matter who you're trying to start a community of practice for. The main thing you have to think about is, even long before they authors came out with value creation framework, when I was faced with my first meeting to try and create my first community of practice, the main thing that I thought about is these people are giving up an hour of their time to come here. They have to leave with something of value. It has to be worthwhile. So the most important thing is to make sure that happens. And they're going to have value of seeing each other and everything. But if they can at least, even the first time, leave with a little bit of potential value, then they're going to want to come back, right? And there's easy tricks that you can do, like activities, checking in, checking out, and circling back each time to make sure that you're drawing those threads of value through the activities.
Então, a resposta da Diane foi que, independente de quem organiza ou como é organizado, é importante que, quando essas pessoas se reúnam nesses grupos que é buscado a organizar, que eles vejam valor no que eles estão criando, no que eles estão fazendo ali, porque por vezes a gente esquece e reúne as pessoas e começa a dar aula ou entregar conteúdo, mas eles têm que intrinsecamente se sentir motivados a estarem ali dentro. E aí ela fala do valor potencial que o modelo do framework de criação de valores traz, que é eu ver interesse e ver uma aplicabilidade daquilo na minha rotina. Então é fundamental falar a linguagem desses jovens, entender as necessidades, os desejos deles para participar desses grupos e endereçar possibilidades e estratégias que eles voltem e se sintam interessados em manter as relações naquele grupo.
And it's very important that, one of the beautiful things about this approach is it's able to answer just-in-time questions where it comes up in practice, and all of a sudden, I need to know how to do this. I need to how to talk to parents who are interfering. Okay, so then you're going to address that, because that coach is then going to leave and be able to take care of its problem in the next session or the next week.
Então, o que a Dani fala que uma dos potenciais ou das belezas desse modelo é que os treinadores e as pessoas que estão na prática podem vir buscar respostas a problemas que eles têm naquele momento. Então, eles se reúnem e buscam respostas para retornar às suas práticas e resolver aqueles problemas. Como um dos exemplos é como é que eu melhoro minha comunicação com os pais dos meus jovens atletas. Então, eles, ao se reunirem, estão tentando resolver aqueles problemas e voltam e buscam resolver, diferente de um processo formal de educação que, por vezes, eu tenho respostas a problemas que eu não tenho.
Michelle, I can give an example of, you asked about, traditional or conservative organizations, and how you get them to support that type of activity.
Okay, I'll just explain in Portuguese before. Eu fiz uma pergunta à Diane aqui nos bastidores de como, entendendo as nossas organizações tradicionais, que vamos pensar em clubes e federações esportivas que ainda operam no modelo de cima para baixo, de gestão, como eles podem se transformar em espaços sociais de aprendizagem.
So, we've talked about the strategic value, about having those strategic conversations. That would be, for instance, I will give you an example. In work that we did with Athletics Canada, what we were able to meet some of the strategic objectives of the sponsoring organization, which is our Own the Podium, okay, by bringing in also the needs of the coaches, by bringing in somebody from the outside, actually from the Canadian Paralympic Committee, to explain the whole accreditation process in Tokyo. Because in parasport, there's always a limited number of accreditations available, but athletes in parasport often have a lot of support persons. And so this was a big question for the coaches. It answered their need, and it answered the need of On the Podium and the Canadian Paralympic Committee. You see alignment.
Ok. Então, o exemplo que a Diane fala, e trazendo para a realidade contextual dela, uma das organizações de paradesporto do Canadá, dentro do framework de criação de valores, eles trazem o conceito de valor estratégico. O valor estratégico é a forma com que você define e busca estruturar condições naquele ambiente para que criem-se valores subsequentes. Então, ela dá o exemplo que eles conseguiram, por meio de uma estratégia, por uma conversa estratégica, unir as necessidades que o patrocinador tinha, trazendo um consultor de fora para fazer uma fala específica para todos os treinadores, para conseguir fazer o alinhamento da estrutura. Então, os treinadores entenderem o que eles estavam buscando, entenderem como aquilo também estava alinhado às necessidades do patrocinador. Então, fazer o papel de organização e alinhamento entre valores é fundamental, fazendo assim as conversas estratégicas que esse facilitador do grupo, o responsável pela comunidade, consegue fazer e consegue ter.
Yeah, so Michelle, I think we have to also underline the importance of the social learning leader, facilitator, whatever, and all those skills that are needed to be sure that, you have to set the right tone from the beginning. Everybody's voice is important. Manage that. There's a lot of, there's a lot of as you know, there's a lot of work in, like we call walking the halls and back track. Yeah.
Yes. O que a Diane traz é que na evolução da teoria, outros conceitos aparecem do facilitador, que é aquele que gere o grupo, para o social learning leader, que é o líder da aprendizagem social, que ele não fica responsável apenas na gestão do grupo para aprendizagem, mas ele trabalha em todo o sistema, tentando buscar e organizar as condições para facilitar a aprendizagem. Então é fundamental que nós entendamos, conheçamos melhor essas funções, entender e endereçar as competências, os conhecimentos necessários para que a gente consiga promover espaços realmente de aprendizagem, porque não é algo simples ou definido a priori, é algo que se faz ao longo do processo. A expressão que a gente usa no Brasil é trocar a roda do carro com ele andando. Então esse papel é fundamental de conceitos de estar sempre avaliando os processos onde está indo o processo de aprendizagem, como eu ajusto e amplio as condições para que a aprendizagem aconteça, fazendo relações com todos os atores desse sistema e desse cenário.
And just so, you can have a very successful social learning space without an outside leader if there are people inside that are interested in taking on some of those roles and, being accountable to the group's learning.
E também é fundamental, porque nós, quando fazemos esse trabalho de líder de aprendizagem social, muitas vezes somos consultores fora, da Diane é consultora fora, mas é fundamental que hajam pessoas dentro realmente preocupadas e que ajudando com que aconteça, porque o consultor de fora ele é apenas um gatilho, ele estimula, mas as pessoas de dentro é que vão ter as condições de fazer com que aquilo aconteça, alinhando expectativas, fazendo com que todos se sintam pertencentes e vindo para esse espaço de aprendizagem comum. Okay, next one. There's a last one here from Paula. I think it's from Paula. I would like to know about your perception in relation to power relations in communities in CPDs. What's CPDs or COPs?
Yeah.
And coaching how situated learning theory would help us to understand the power relations. So, pode colocar na tela, por favor, Paula. Então, a percepção das relações de poder nas comunidades de prática, pronto, da professora Carla Lughetti, sobre as percepções de poder nas comunidades de prática e como a aprendizagem situada pode ajudar a entender essas relações de poder.
Wow. Okay. Lots of good questions there. Super important, power relations. Like you can kill it in the first time. I actually have witnessed that myself, where I was working with one group of coaches, including the head coach, and it was a really good community of practice. And so another group asked me to come and do the same thing. The head coach of that group asked me, but he had all these young coaches at the table, and we did the same thing where they were going around and sharing their ideas. And after about the fourth or fifth young coach stood up with an idea, the head coach jumped up, slammed his hand on the table and said, "I hate that drill." And that was the end of it. He killed that social learning space. We actually didn't even have any more meetings. I told him, forget it.
Então, a Diane fala que endereçar as relações de poder dentro das comunidades é fundamental e é um dos elementos centrais para a gente conseguir compreender e entender, e ela traz o exemplo de um dos trabalhos que ela fez com 2 grupos de treinadores, em que no primeiro grupo ela conseguiu entrar e criar o ambiente para a facilitação, para que a aprendizagem acontecesse, mas no segundo grupo, o treinador principal, ao iniciar as atividades, ele já bateu na mesa e falou, eu odiei isso eu não gosto. Então, a condição dele ter essa atitude frente aos demais treinadores jovens fez com que a comunidade nem começasse a acontecer, porque ele já estabeleceu que aquilo não funcionaria. Então, é fundamental que essas relações de poder apareçam, sejam interpretadas para conseguir, talvez, ajustar ou eliminar essas diferenças para que a aprendizagem realmente apareça e aconteça.
Yeah, so I was a novice at that point in doing this, and I had a good experience with my first group, so I assumed it would be the same. So now I would be careful to establish ground rules. So we have the expression that everybody, this was actually a quote from the head coach of my first community practice. He said, "One thing is certain, every person leaves their ego at the door when they come to the room."
Então, ela fala que essa experiência foi no início da carreira dela, como consultora, trabalhando nesses grupos, e foi um dos maiores aprendizados. E ela traz consigo hoje a frase que ela teve do primeiro treinador, do grupo que deu certo, que se é para fazer com que a comunidade aconteça, a aprendizagem aconteça de maneira mútua, os egos devem ser deixados de fora. Então, talvez é algo que ela traz das primeiras experiências até hoje para compreender e determinar algumas regras iniciais para que a comunidade possa acontecer, ou senão ela não vai dar certo ou não vai ter continuidade.
A good social learning space is flat within it. You have vision to the upside and the downside, strategically, but inside it's flat.
Então, isso é fundamental. Um espaço social de aprendizagem efetivo, ele tem uma horizontalização nas relações de poder. Então, é importante que entendam qual é a visão, onde está, quem são as pessoas, mas quando estão dentro, que hajam realmente uma relação de equilíbrio entre os participantes para que a aprendizagem realmente aconteça, se as pessoas não tenham receio ou medo de falar ou trocar informações ali dentro.
Okay. I don't know if we are finishing our time now, or are we carrying on?
Well, yeah, but we are finishing. You are on time. I just need to say again, thank you so much, Diane, to be with here again, even virtually. We really appreciate all the time that you are in Brazil.
Thanks. Yeah, I can't wait to come back.
And I hope to see you again here next year, or maybe in another country that we can really touch each other and have some big hug to celebrate. Thank you so much. It was awesome, your participation here. Thank you.
Yeah, obrigada. And I really do mean that if people have other questions, they can email me and I'll get back to them as soon as I can.
Então, a Diane, eu falei para ela que é sempre um prazer ela estar conosco, mesmo de maneira virtual. Ela tem costume de estar conosco aqui no Brasil, e que seja que a próxima vinda dela a gente possa realmente nos encontrar, nos abraçarmos, porque é sempre muito bom tê-la conosco. E ela disse, ela agradece e falou que realmente, se quem tiver dúvidas e quiser mandar e-mail para ela, por favor, faça isso, porque é o maior prazer que ela tem para conversar sobre o tema. Diane, thank you so much again.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Pessoal, agora a gente tem alguns recados finais para o evento e a continuidade para amanhã. Paula, você pode entrar para fazer as falas, por favor?
Eu entrei aqui num susto, né? Tô brincando. Pessoal, boa noite. Só passando por aqui para dizer que amanhã a gente tem programação o dia inteiro de novo. Pela manhã, às 10 horas, uma playlist vai ficar disponível no nosso canal, nesse canal que vocês estão acessando. O tema de amanhã vai ser percurso de jovens no esporte, então é o tema do dia todo. 10 horas da manhã tem essa playlist com alguns vídeos. Depois, às 16 horas, a gente tem uma mesa e depois, às 19, outra conferência. Lembrando, esses horários são horários de Brasília, tá? Oficial de Brasília. Então, quem precisar fazer o ajuste em relação ao seu fuso horário, por favor, faça, tá bom? Percurso de jovens, temos convidados internacionais ao longo do dia todo e também convidados do nosso Brasil. Então, venham. Obrigada pela participação ao longo do dia. E para quem não segue a gente ainda no Instagram, entra por lá que a gente tem divulgado a programação, caso vocês se esqueçam, tá bom? Um bom descanso a todos e todas. Obrigada, Michelle. Thank you, Diane. E a gente se vê amanhã, gente. Tchau, tchau.